Welcome to RETN Roundtable, a program featuring discussions and dialogue on topics of community interest.
On today's program, a conversation with Ian Baldwin and Rob Williams of the print and online forum, Vermont Commons.
Hello and welcome to RETN Roundtable. Today a discussion about Vermont Commons, a print and online forum exploring the idea of Vermont independence. And I'm very pleased to have with us two guests, Ian Baldwin, who is the publisher of Vermont Commons, and Rob Williams, who is the editor of Vermont Commons as well as associate publisher. And I won't go into all the background for both of you because then we'll run out of time to talk. But two folks who've been around and been involved in Vermont discussion and thinking for a long time. But Vermont Commons is fairly new, a little over a year old. And after a year, it's interesting, when I looked into Vermont Commons and what it was all about, I got all the way back to the late 1770s and the idea of a Vermont independent republic. And I'm curious what you're trying to do and how that's going with the publication, both online and in print.
We became a project or spin-off of something called the Second Vermont Republic, which is a group of folks meeting to talk about Vermont independence and the whole concept of being an independent republic, because Vermont was an independent republic at the very beginning of its status as a government and a state for 11 years. So the journal is sort of the offspring of that larger movement.
So the Second Vermont Republic, or the second Vermont Republic is a broader discussion that's been going on for some time now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Second Vermont Republic really is about kind of the exploring the political notion of secession, of actually peaceably extricating ourselves from the United States empire. And Vermont Commons is really more about looking at the question of independence more broadly, beyond sort of the political, looking at questions of energy independence, questions of agriculture and agricultural independence, food security, as we like to talk about, homestead security, as opposed to homeland security. The idea that Vermonters perhaps could better feed and clothe and power and educate themselves as an independent republic than as one of 50 states in the U.S., United States Empire. Yeah.
I want to explore that a little bit because I think there may be people who sit and hear that and go, "You got to be kidding!" Right? I mean,
we've gotten that reaction.
I'm sure you have. But could Vermont really do that? I mean, I guess to step outside. I mean,
is it even conceivable?
Is this just a great intellectual pursuit?
No, it's eminently conceivable. 10 of the richest per capita nations in the world, half of those 10 are smaller than Vermont.
Population-wise?
Population-wise. Of the 5 who are smaller than Vermont, only one has a significant army, and that's 900 soldiers. So the common denominator is they are all intensely interdependent on the rest of the world. They trade. And so the myth seems to appear to people who don't perhaps think about it is, oh, well, you want to go it alone and wall yourselves off. On the contrary, you're more dependent and more interconnected with the world as your own small republic than you are being a very small to almost insignificant part of a much bigger entity, which in our case today is an empire. I mean, I don't think anyone can argue about that.
People will often confuse Vermont independence with isolationism, as Ian said, sort of walling yourself off from the rest of the world. Nothing could be further from the truth. What we're interested in at Vermont Commons and the Second Vermont Republic is, you use the word interdependence, trade, commerce with the rest of the world. We've got you know, so many fabulous Vermont businesses, for example, here in the state right now, doing something like $600 billion worth of trade, or maybe that's too high, but I forget the number. But
that's way too
high. That would be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But it's impressive.
It's impressive. And, you know, Canada's our second biggest trading partner. I think we're trading something like 40% of our trade is with Canada, for example. So we're not talking about economic isolationism. We're talking about economic interdependence as an independent entity.
And it's true. I think that many people have experienced even the anecdotal fact that if you travel, if you get far enough away from Vermont and you tell people you're from Vermont, they tend to question, where's that? And equate it to being part of New York or part of Quebec or something like that.
Sometimes they know and know it's like already got an independent kingdom status.
But the idea that Vermont is so small within this 50-state republic that it has the bare minimum, literally. The congressional delegation is 3, and will never be more than that. And the economic clout is compared to juggernauts like California and New York. Is insignificant.
Insignificant.
And we would argue, too, just to sort of pick up on your use of the word republic, we would argue that the United States actually is no longer a viable republic. It is, in fact, as Ian just pointed out, an empire. And because it's an empire, we have to think very seriously about how we move forward as citizens of the state of Vermont within the context of this massive empire that appears to be sort of dominating the world right now.
The way I got involved was it's when I began to realize that we were an empire and looked back at history, I didn't see an example of an empire that was also fundamentally a democracy. And of course, this is all post 9/11 and Homeland Security and all the many threats that some of us feel to our basic constitutional rights. So the idea of an empire and a democracy being one and the same thing, I couldn't swallow it. And when you can't swallow it, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to choose? So that was my impetus.
And Vermont is filled with so many very small businesses and such. I mean, you've run one, and do you find that those businesses are already interdependent in that manner? That you would imagine if it was an independent republic, already in
could they stand on their own?
Are they really already acting like that? Being interdependent, trade with Canada and international relations.
Well, they wouldn't be paying taxes to Washington. They'd pay taxes to, let's say, Montpelier. And that would be a big difference right there. But yeah, they would continue to trade with the rest of the United States, as Rob sometimes says, the rest of the dis-United States.
Is there much support for this idea? I saw in Vermont Commons, I read 8% of Vermonters favor secession. Is that's single digits? That seems small.
Yeah, I think if you put that in context, though, it's pretty interesting. We did a Center for Rural Studies poll 2 months ago, actually 3 months ago now, in February. And as it turns out, in fact, 8% of the folks that were polled suggested indeed that Vermont ought to peaceably secede from the United States. And to put that in context, 8% doesn't sound like a large number, but first of all, that number makes the Vermont independence movement the #1 sort of movement within the 50 states, bigger than Alaska's independence movement, bigger than Hawaii's independence movement. And the second thing is that historically, revolution